Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, an update on federal climate action with the League of Conservation Voters. Next slide. We are joined today by Sara Chieffo, who is LCV's Vice President for Government Affairs. From executive orders to cabinet nominations, so much has already happened in the new Biden-Harris administration. And we're really grateful that Sara is here to walk us through some of that and share a preview of what we can expect in the next 100 days or so. Next slide. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations work to protect Maine's environment and our democracy by building diverse coalitions, influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Next slide. A couple of technical notes for today. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. You can send questions directly to me, Kathleen, through the chat whenever they occur to you. And I'll keep track of those and we can ask Sara in a Q&A session at the end. If you have any technical difficulties today, please send a message to Will Sedlak through the chat and he can help you out. This Lunch and Learn is being recorded and we will share the recording with you later today in a follow-up email. You can find it on our website where you'll also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thanks again for joining us. And Sara, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. It is a true honor and pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Sara Chieffo. As Kathleen said, I am our Vice President of Government Affairs at the national counterpart to Maine Conservation Voters, the National League of Conservation Voters. And as I said, I'm really happy to be here and we really share the same mission that you have at the state level, at the national level. And so we're very focused on building political power for the people and the planet and influencing policy at the national level, but ever more so our policy agenda is interwoven at the state and the national level. We work to hold politicians accountable, as you all do too, and to win elections. And this deep partnership with Maine Conservation Voters and the other 30 state affiliates that we have is a core part of our theory of change at National LCV, how we do our work, and what sets us apart from many of our sister environmental organizations that we work so closely with. So before I jump into my presentation, a little bit more about me. I've been at League of Conservation Voters since 2009. That makes me an old hand. When I started at LCV, I had no children and no gray hair. So I have lived through a lot at LCV and we've grown, we've almost tripled in size over that course of time. I lead our national advocacy work on climate change and clean energy policy. And I believe firmly that tackling the climate crisis is a huge opportunity. It's not all doom and gloom. It's an opportunity to put people back to work in good jobs and to build a more fair society. And the work I've been doing over the last 12 or so years at LCV is really coming to fruition in ways that like pinch me, I can hardly believe it. We're here with the Biden-Harris administration and the trifecta in Congress, albeit a very tight one. I also, before I jump in, just want to say that, I didn't come to this work with this recognition, but I am trying to live it every day now, but recognizing that climate change and toxic pollution don't hit every community equally. Because of environmental and systemic racism, communities of color, lower income communities, and tribal communities have been saddled with and harmed by fossil fuel polluters and are also typically the least responsible for, but the most harmed by climate change. At LCV, we also believe, and I believe deeply, that we have to have a functioning democracy to have the bold change that we need. That includes access to voting and having engaged citizens like you involved in making our democracy work. As has been said by many others, democracy is not a spectator sport. So excited that you all are here, you're engaged, and excited for the conversation we're gonna have. I should say I also am deeply motivated, even in the toughest of times, by my two strong-willed daughters, who I hope at someday will take over the world, but they keep me laughing even in tough times these days. All right, so what I'm gonna cover today is first an update on what's been happening at the national level already, just in the first few weeks of the Biden-Harris administration, provide a bit of a background and sort of hopefully a behind the scenes look at how we got here, and then give you guys a little bit of an insider look at the future action we expect in the coming weeks and months. But before we do that, I wanted to provide an opportunity to start with some inspiration and some art, recognizing that talking at people for half an hour can be a little dull. And so I thought, who best to beam into you than our own first Youth National Poet Laureate with Amanda Gormand, who stole the show at the inauguration. I think hopefully everybody was able to see her remarks. This is a poem that she wrote a few years ago called Earth Rising. So Will, if you'd be willing to play the show. Are others able to hear the audio? Thumbs up or thumbs down? I can't hear the audio, Will. Sorry, you might.
Yay, nay?
No audio.
Yay.
Maybe try on the bottom. Did it get muted when I put it in the slide, maybe?
It did, and this is a Zoom feature. Kathleen, would you just drop the link into the chat for folks?
Yes, I just need to pull it up.
Sorry about the technical difficulties, all that. I'm sure I did it wrong when I put it in here. Apologies.
No, this is just Zoom being Zoom, Sarah.
Okay. Although at least I haven't had to say, oh, I'm sorry, I was on mute, which is like, I feel like if I had $1 for every time I had to say that over the last year, we would all be better off in my family.
Sorry, it's very slow for me to pull this up, but I'm working on it.
Great, no worries. All right, here it is, everybody. Enjoy. This is about a 4-minute video, so hopefully everybody on the count of 3 hit play at home. 1, 2, 3, go. Great. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to make it through Amanda's amazing poem and her reading. I'm deeply inspired by her words, and I think I couldn't have teed up the opportunity and the import of the moment that we're at in our history right now. So with that preview, let's jump in. So top line takeaway here. I'm going to throw a lot at you over the next 15, 20 minutes, but the top line takeaway I want you to start and end this presentation with is the Biden-Harris administration is taking a historic whole of government response to the climate crisis. President Biden campaigned on climate change as being among the top 4 crises he wanted to address, those being the pandemic, economic inequality, racial inequality, and climate change. They campaigned on this, and they didn't just put a plan out and leave it there. This was part of their closing argument and how they motivated their winning coalition of voters, and they now have a mandate for action. I want to note something else pretty historic about the election here. Last summer, then candidate Biden put out the strongest plan we've ever seen on climate and environmental justice. Now, for those political insiders, will note that they put that increased plan out in the context of the general election. Typically, candidates go to the center after a primary race, right? And I think this really speaks to how centrally climate and environmental justice and creating good paying jobs in this transformation is to the commitment of the Biden-Harris administration. So what made their plan so historic? And I'm going to go through this because there's an arc here between what they campaigned on and what they're doing now that they're in office. They committed to at least a $2 trillion economic investment in rebuilding a climate smart future, with 40% of those benefits going to communities on the front lines of climate change impacts and pollution. Those are called environmental justice communities. Traditionally, low-income communities, communities of color, tribal communities, but also many lower-income white communities as well. They committed to 100% clean electricity by 2035. That commitment would not have been possible without the work across the conservation voter movement and here in Maine to center that 100% clean energy campaign we've been jointly running. They committed to zero emission new buildings by 2030. They committed to expanding transportation electrification and transitioning all school buses from diesel, dirty diesel that's harming our kids, to clean electric. They committed to massive retrofits and sustainable buildings and making our spaces, our homes, our buildings more efficient. They also committed to link in our climate and our conservation goals, including embracing a commitment to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. I know a goal that's been embraced here in Maine and you've heard from past speakers on. They also committed to eliminating legacy toxic pollution and increase enforcement against polluters. So as I said, on the campaign trail, Biden and Harris really told the public what they're going to do. They campaigned on this climate and environmental justice action plan. It was hugely important in delivering them their winning coalition, especially among young voters and voters of color, and they're already acting on their mandate for action. Importantly here, their climate and environmental justice agenda is embedded in their economic recovery agenda and at the heart of their Build Back Better agenda, which is a position we've never been in before. I want to underscore this is not as if we have a third term of the Obama administration. This is fundamentally different, that from the get-go, we have an administration already using the whole tools of the federal government, putting climate action at the heart of their international, their domestic, and their economic agendas. Next slide, please. Now, it's important to notice, and we say a lot of this around LCV, that personnel is policy. Raise your hand if anybody heard personnel is policy. Okay, it can feel like a little trite of a phrase, but I can't underscore that when you go through administrative transitions from one president to the next, who you put in place matters hugely, and it is so important. So I want to run through really what is a climate dream team, not just at the important EPA or Department of Transportation, but across the federal government. So highlights, we have Deb Haaland nominated to head the Department of the Interior, the first Indigenous person to lead this agency. She was our top champion on our 30 by 30 campaign. She's going to be able to respect tribal sovereignty rights in ways that have never been done in the history of our country or at DOI. Jennifer Granholm, a true Pied Piper and champion for clean energy, former Michigan governor, going to be heading the Department of Energy. She led the rebuilding of the American auto industry after the Great Recession. She's an incredible advocate for clean energy and clean manufacturing renaissance here in the United States. EPA's nominee, Michael Regan, He led all in the North Carolina state counterpart to the EPA, and he's known for his ability to work across all parties, business, environmental justice groups, has led cleanups for PFAS contamination. He's going to be leading restoring sound science in our rulemaking and in delivering on the environmental justice commitments. He's also the first Black man to ever lead the EPA. Department of Transportation, major role to play in vehicle electrification and in making sure our cars and trucks are far more fuel efficient and go fully electric. He, on the campaign trail as candidate, Buttigieg was extremely strong on his climate action plan. And he's really passionate about from his time as mayor, about green infrastructure, natural solutions, and also working on clean and electric vehicles as part of rebooting our economy. He's also going to be he is now the first openly gay cabinet secretary now that he's been confirmed. Janet Yellen, under Obama administration, nobody looked at Treasury as a climate agency. They now are fully on board, and she's been very vocal about using Treasury's powers to mitigate the economic risk of climate change and put us on a path to clean energy, 100% clean energy. She's also the first woman ever to head the Department of Treasury. Brian Deese, I know one of Maine's own and also a former board member for LCV, is leading the National Economic Council. We've never had somebody who is as deeply knowledgeable and committed to climate action as he is leading in that role. And he's going to be leading in the economic recovery investments that this administration makes. And finally, we've got a team of incredible lieutenants to lead this whole of government climate response, with Gina McCarthy, former head of the Environmental Protection Agency, most recently with Natural Resources Defense Council, as the first ever national climate czar, working very closely with her deputy, Ali Zaidi, to spearhead the domestic collaboration around climate action. And then we have John Kerry, somebody of his stature to lead as the special presidential envoy for climate change, is a huge signal to the world about how serious this administration is taking climate action and putting it at the heart of our international agenda, not just in climate negotiations, but across all the tools, whether those be trade agreements, bilateral agreements, and the rest. And not on this slide, but really importantly, it's hard to communicate what level of caliber of political appointees they have at the sub-cabinet level and the worker bee level already in place to be leveraging the government action from day one. Next slide, please, Will. Great. So let me go through a little bit of what Biden did on his very first day in office. And apologies that this is recapping what folks already know, but I think it's worth spending a minute on. So on day one, rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Start a process of undoing the more than 100 environmental rollbacks that we saw under the Trump administration. And importantly, it wasn't just undoing the harm, but it was charging the agencies with centering climate science, public health protections, and getting them working on critical regulations to reduce toxic pollution and carbon pollution from cars and methane and more. Also stop the Keystone XL pipeline. That's probably the piece that's gotten among the most press in terms of its pushback and as a wedge issue with between labor and environmentalists. And we'll get a little bit more to some of our coalition politics here as we move on in this conversation. They also halted the drilling process in the Arctic Refuge, a huge priority for ours, and most importantly for the Gwich'in, who consider the Arctic Refuge their sacred homelands. Next slide, please. You guys, week one, we had a National Climate Day. We're doing it. They declared a climate day on January 27th, and it almost rolled out a difficult to even comprehend scope of action. So I will do probably inadequate job of here summarizing the scope, but let me just hit a few highlights. So as I mentioned, this whole of government response is really unprecedented. And what they did to codify that was to create this National Climate Task Force that coordinates, as I said, not just across the EPA or the Department of Energy, which you might think of, but 20 federal agencies. So this is really what the sort of unsexy behind the scenes coordination of the federal government branches looks like. And so it's going to be headed by the National Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy. And they also announced that they're going to be hosting a World Climate Leaders Summit on Earth Day in April. And this is where our domestic and our international actions are going to come together. We expect that the administration will announce their new commitments in the context of global climate agreements of what the US can do to limit carbon pollution by 2030. In the behind the scenes parlance, that's called our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Climate Agreement, or an NDC. This is basically how we can signal to our partners. We're not saying we're back in, but we're saying here's what we can do in terms of reducing our carbon pollution emissions by 2030. And you can hold us, you can take those commitments to the bank, because we can show you all these actions we're doing that will make up that contribution. So it's a real sprint between now and April to get these actions up and running. Second major piece, and I touched on this when I talked about what they committed to on the campaign trail, but they committed to creating, to centering a government-wide commitment to environmental justice, and to elevating this not just to an EPA issue, but to a White House level priority. They created 2 working groups, the Environmental Justice Interagency Council to coordinate across all of the agencies, and then created, importantly, a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council to center the environmental justice communities and their voices in policymaking, and to advise on modernizing and strengthening the first and only ever national executive order on environmental justice that was put in place in 1994 under the Clinton administration. But to be honest, has never really lived up to the spirit of delivering environmental justice, because the racial disparities and exposure to pollution persist today. They also, as part of that commitment, rolled out a Justice 40, which is how they translated their commitment to 40% of infrastructure investment benefits going to environmental justice communities. And importantly, they created a scorecard. Who loves a scorecard? We all do. We know how important it is for accountability, right? And so they're actually going to do a scorecard that they put out regularly, showing how the federal government is doing against those commitments they've made. We know this is critical both from an accountability perspective and to track their real progress. They also committed to building out the government's ability to have the data they need to know that we're driving the outcomes around economic inequality and around exposure to toxic pollution. And so they're building out a tool called at the EPA called Environmental Justice Screen, or EJ Screen, to really make sure we are identifying the communities that should receive those 40% of benefits. And they're going to be doing that in partnership with academics and with environmental justice partners and other experts. Third piece here is the government has a ton of capacity to shape policy outcomes just by what a big force they are in terms of both their purchasing power as well as other procurement policies. And so they rolled out on Climate Day a commitment to lead by example in this clean energy transformation that grows good union-paying jobs and invests in American-made clean energy products. And I can't underscore how important that renaissance for domestic US manufacturing and clean energy is important, both to the right policy outcomes, but also to our politics and being able to defend these wins on the long haul. So they committed to using their procurement powers to align with our climate goals, as I said. They reaffirmed their commitment to 100% clean electricity in the power sector by 2035. Again, cleaning up our power sector is the backbone for decarbonization in our economy. It's essential that we do that first and then build out into our other sectoral pieces. And they committed to going totally electric and all clean vehicles in the government fleets. They also created a civilian conservation corps to put young people and other people to work protecting our lands, restoring them, and helping make them part of the climate solution. That brings me to my next point, where they made a series of announcements and actions on Climate Day to really align our management of our lands and waters with our goals of tackling the climate crisis. So this is where they committed the federal government to the goal of protecting 30% of our lands and ocean by 2030. And importantly, they rolled this out alongside a consultation process with communities, with tribes, with farmers, with ranchers, and other stakeholders to make sure that we're identifying the right places to protect and that communities are involved in shaping the use and the identification of those areas. They also announced a one-year moratorium on new fossil fuel leasing on our lands and waters. This is something we pushed really passionately for. And it's also what's gotten the most political pushback. There's already ads running by the American Petroleum Institute and others trying to say that this is the end of all jobs as we know it. And they're trying to drive a wedge, actually saying this is going to rob local schools and communities of their tax base. And we're going to have our politics and our work cut out for us to push back on the well-heeled and well-moneyed fossil fuel opposition here. They also committed in this space to charging all agencies to end direct subsidies to fossil fuels and their further expansion. And excitingly, especially off our Northeast coast, they committed to doubling offshore wind by 2030, which is a huge opportunity for us in the clean energy space and good jobs creation space. So a few more thoughts here. It is well known, but probably the environmental community has talked too little about this, that there are communities that are really, really impacted by a transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And so what the administration committed to was really to centering an investment strategy that is community-led for communities that are transitioning off of fossil fuels. This is coal communities and communities who have had power plants shut down. This is an interagency working force. They created an interagency working group to support this work, which spans many different federal agencies. It's chaired again by Gina McCarthy, the National Climate Advisor, and Brian Deese, the National Economic Council, so that we're working collaboratively across all those tools. And they're going to be investing in putting people back to work, reducing toxic pollution that exists in these communities, like abandoned mines and oil and gas wells, but also to really diversifying these communities who have been too reliant on just one source of income. So real economic diversification effort there. Okay, great. All right. And then finally, they committed to centering science, which sounds trite, but is a night and day change from where we were with the Trump administration. And they announced a couple of important protections for limiting political interference with scientists, which is what we saw used to so much detriment under the Trump administration. Great, next slide, please. Okay, so a few musings from me about how did we get here. So we've got two images on the slide here. One is of the largest ever wave of climate protests a number of years ago. And then the second is the sort of disturbing orange haze that impacted not just the communities directly affected by the historic wildfires last summer, but even into major metropolitan areas, of course, here when we've got with the image of the Golden Gate Bridge. So a couple of thoughts here, just to leave you here with impacts, climate impacts. 10 years ago, the last time we were getting ready for federal climate action and legislating, climate change impacts weren't felt and seen across the country in the way that they are. And I think this has become a kitchen table issue. People see and know and feel climate change in a way that they haven't before. This has helped drive the salience of the issue. Unfortunately, it's harming far too many communities across the country. So I think it's really led to some of the increase in focus on climate change that shows up in public polling, but also shows up for legislators. Part of the reason I chose Amanda Gorman's poem to start today was the key role that youth have had in upping the ambition of politicians, in upping the ambition, honestly, of the climate, traditional green groups and climate community, and their ability to break through in demanding the urgency that climate so desperately deserves. The other thing we've seen over the last decade plus is back when we were talking about legislating, as I said, back in 2009 and 10, the clean energy industry was really a promise. It was not here. And what we've seen is over the last 10 years, the clean energy economy really take hold and become real and robust and cost competitive. Right now, in almost every jurisdiction, it is cheaper for new power to come online that is clean, renewable power. So that has helped a ton with our agenda. And then I would be remiss if I didn't name how important the state level progress, historic state level progress on clean energy and climate change has been to shaping the agenda, building the momentum for bold leadership at the national level. And of course, couldn't mention this without a huge shout out to all of your work in Maine and the historic climate action plan by Governor Mills. I love it. Maine can't wait. I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you for all your work here to support that. And then, speaking of the clean energy industry, I recognize that that job growth, unfortunately, has not always been in good clean energy union jobs. And I think we've missed an opportunity over the last 10 years to build alliances with union partners and to really make sure that the kind of jobs we're creating are jobs that support high dignity work with benefits and with family sustaining wages and other protections. So that brings me to my next slide, which is related to sort of how we got here. But over the last, certainly since the failure of the landmark 2009 legislation, and then our failure to even get a vote in the Senate, we really had to do a lot of soul searching on, why couldn't we get the grassroots and overwhelming support for comprehensive climate legislation? And so as part of that reflection, we've been working to expand what we define as climate action. A lot of it's already been covered here, but I wanted to give real thanks and lifting up to 2 partnerships that LCV has been engaged in. The first is the image on the left here is the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. This is a partnership that we started a few years ago in 2018 with just first listening to environmental justice partners and allies who have felt rightfully for decades that the national environmental community has not listened to the plight of environmental justice communities, has not recognized their leadership, have not worked in partnership, and has advocated for policies that have certainly not addressed, but in some cases even led to, like with cap and trade policies, an accumulation of further toxic pollution in their communities and communities of color and low-income communities. And so we've been working over the last 3 years to rebuild trust, and in the summer of 2019, worked together to roll out the first ever joint platform for redefining jointly our climate agenda that centers economic and racial justice. And I just want to name here this really is linking climate action, which can be seen as a faraway problem and parts per million in the atmosphere, with delivering real benefits to communities who have been underinvested in and suffering with the burden of pollution. And to making sure that as we take and seize this historic opportunity to rebuild our economy in a low carbon way, that we don't repeat the inequities that have been part of the fossil fuel based economy. And this is also a commitment to make sure that our environmental justice partners, who often haven't had access to the halls of Congress and the backdoor rooms or deals are struck, that we're jointly advocating and working together to make sure that communities on the front lines of these problems are centered in how policy is shaped and how it is executed. Second major partnership, as I mentioned here, was really to rebuild more relationships with our brothers and sisters in organized labor. And we joined a few years ago the now 10-year-old partnership of the Blue-Green Alliance. And we worked through that partnership to put out, also in the summer of 2019, a joint action plan for climate that really addressed economic inequality in our country and framed these issues as climate change and economic inequality as deeply interwoven, and so much must our solutions be. And one more point here is that I think it's, the fossil fuel industry and those who want to stay in power have exploited economic inequality to keep the status quo. And that's a part of the reason why labor partnership is so important. So I'm almost done talking at you. We've got one more slide here, which is our look ahead. So we're in, the first day actions and then the announcements on the 27th are really the start of a marathon of action and sprints that we're going to have here in the both congressional action and then with further action under the Biden-Harris administration. So I want to name a few key opportunities here. Congress and the administration are obviously laser focused, rightfully so, on addressing the COVID pandemic. They're fighting right now over a $1.9 trillion package to really make sure that we can deploy the vaccine at scale, get this crisis, the health and economic crisis underway, that people get direct relief to make sure we can weather the next few months. But then they're going to pivot to a massive economic recovery package. And that is where we see a once in a generation opportunity to make historic investments in this transformation that we need across our power, transportation, buildings, and land sectors to jumpstart our transition to a fully net zero economy. And so a couple of goals here that should look pretty similar to what we've already covered here, but is making sure that economic recovery package delivers 40% of investments in these environmental justice communities, that we're investing in a whole cross section of solutions to build healthy communities, reduce pollution, to, as I said, speed this transformation in clean electricity, clean transportation. There's a ton of work we need to do in ramping up storage and transmission to unlock that 100% clean power sector work. And then there's a ton of partnership here with labor and good union jobs in retrofitting buildings and rebuilding our pipelines and our water infrastructure, and in investing in natural climate solutions to build resilience and support equitable access to our natural spaces and our outdoors. A little bit, so that's the next, we're going to be pivoting to that as soon as later this month when the president gives his joint address to Congress, tentatively the February 23rd. We'll then pivot a few month sprint likely via the arcane process of reconciliation to avoid the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. And then we'll be also working at the same time across the federal agencies, now I'm pivoting back to executive branch action, to put in place swift and bold action through the regulatory process to limit carbon pollution from cars and trucks, power plants, and methane leaks, super pollutant in the oil and gas space. And then all eyes are on that Earth Day World Leader Summit, as I mentioned, and the U.S. is rolling out their commitment of what they can achieve, what we can achieve by 2030. So with that, I am, apologize, I went a little bit over, but we really appreciate the time and look forward to the conversation. So Kathleen,
Sarah, thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you started things off with that beautiful poem from Amanda Gorman. And I'm so sorry, everyone, for the technical glitches. I did drop a link to that poem into the chat, and I'll send that out in the email follow-up that you'll get later this afternoon. So if you weren't able to hear it today, definitely take a few minutes to click on it and listen. It is beautiful and really set a great tone. Sarah, wow, it's so exciting and such a relief to hear about all of these great early actions. We have all been working together for so long, and the president's executive orders and the climate dream team and all of those pieces are just, feels really good. We know there's a lot still to do, but let's take a second to celebrate and say thank you. Also in the follow-up email this afternoon, we'll share a link that makes it really easy to send a message directly to the White House, thanking the administration for starting off strong. I clicked through just to make sure it was working, and I got a really nice response, which just adds to my general giddiness about the change of tone in Washington. So let's ask some questions. You mentioned, Sarah, that right now the federal government is kind of catching up to some of the really great state level action that places like Maine have been leading for a while now. Can we expect the climate action at the federal level to result in funding to help Maine implement our climate action plan? And how do we make sure that happens? Where's the right place to advocate for that kind of funding?
Fantastic question, Kathleen. And I think it points to a really important reality that is too often the state government is seen in its silo and the federal government is seen in its silo. And with the scale of the climate crisis, we're only going to be able to tackle it if we are working all together. And so there's a ton, as you said, Kathleen, a ton of synergy between the work that's been pioneered in states like Maine, but also, we've seen historic action in about 18 states now over the last few years. And so a lot of the investments that we're going to make through the tax code and through this economic recovery legislation are going to help, well, are first going to be implemented by your state and local governments. So they have a major role in making sure these dollars get out and get spent on the right projects. And then secondly, they're going to have a major role in advocating for those funds. And so I would say the window for influence is really coming up quickly here. And we'll be working collaboratively with the policy team at MCV and across the CVM to make sure that the programs we're advocating for, whether it be cleaning up superfield and brownfield sites or 10-year tax credits for clean energy and transmission EVs, are done in the way that best fits what implementing your agenda at the state and local level is. So I think there's total synergy, and I think there'll be opportunities to directly advocate with your legislators and your senators to make sure that this economic recovery package meets the moment of what we need on this historic investment on climate and justice and jobs.
That's fabulous. Thank you. Speaking of that climate dream team, where are we on confirmations? I know that some folks have already been confirmed. Who are we worried about getting those through? What's the status?
Yeah, so this was one of the things before we had the amazing wins for Senators Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia that I was really, really worried about, is like, are we going to see Senate Republicans, if the Senate had been under Republican control, really try to block the Biden administration from getting in their team of cabinet nominees and the team they need to execute on their agenda. And thankfully, we're seeing a fair amount of comedy and collaboration around the confirmation process. And especially that's speeded by the fact that, the Senate is in Democratic control. And so we don't have some of the hurdles we would have seen. But we're also seeing, some willingness among on both sides of the aisle to just have the Biden-Harris team get their team in place. And so, for example, we're early in the confirmation process. We would have liked to get everybody in. We're sort of a third of the way through with our Confirm Climate campaign, but we're optimistic that we're going to be able to get our teams confirmed. Of course, Secretary Buttigieg is already in, Janet Yellen's already in, Secretary Designate Granholm from DOE has gone through committee, won 4 Republican votes in committee. So we're optimistic about her getting to the floor. I was really worried about Michael Regan, given what a target EPA has with its agenda on robust regulations. But the 2 North Carolina senators, Burr and Tillis, who are both Republicans, are supporting him. So I feel much better about him being able to get through a positive Senate floor vote. And just one arcane piece of Senate procedure. So the Senate is evenly divided. It is 50-50. And so folks may have seen in the press that it took weeks, but Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell were able to reach a power sharing agreement. So if nominations or legislation fails on a tie vote in committee, there's still a process to discharge that nominee or legislation straight to the floor. So somebody like Regan, who might be evenly split in committee, can still come to the floor. So I just offer that even though it's 50-50, we can still get folks taken out of that committee quagmire. And then Deb Haaland, I'll just say, given how much opposition there's been on the oil and gas leasing pause and other pieces, we are really working hard to make sure she can get across the goal line in the Senate for so many reasons. Her commitment to these issues, her leadership, as well as the history-making nature of her nomination of being the first Indigenous woman to lead that agency, or be a cabinet member.
Absolutely. And I know for folks who are wanting to get those to-the-minute updates on where we stand, I know LCV and certainly MCV, we can't help but celebrate these things as soon as they come across our desks. So follow us on all of our social media platforms, and we'll keep you posted as it happens. You mentioned the politics of the progress that we need to make. It's not just as simple as maybe the policy is not simple either, but it's certainly more complicated by the politics. What do we need to keep in mind to make sure that we're fighting for climate action now and being aware of the politics, so we make sure we keep that pro-climate majority in the House? Anything? We've got some political folks online who say, should we start thinking about the 2022 elections already?
It is not too soon to start thinking about 2020 elections. We have a evenly split Senate and a very narrow margin in the House, a reduced margin. But here's what I would say about that, Kathleen. I think, first of all, the policy transforming our entire economy and society at a pace and scale we've never seen before is what we have to do to tackle climate change. So I wish we could do it in one bill or one thing, but this is going to be a 10-year, and the scientists have made this clear, like we have until 2030 to really turn the ship around. And so this is going to be a whole scale mobilization. And I think part of the reason I start that way, to answer this question that way, is we have a huge opportunity to be working with our frontliners who are up in 2022, to be going on offense in some of the pickup opportunities in the Senate around this clean energy manufacturing, good jobs revolution that we are part of here, and to go on offense. We don't need to be on defense on our agenda. And infrastructure has historically been an area of bipartisan compromise and collaboration. And so because we are so central to the economic Build Back Better agenda, I'm actually really hopeful that we are going to be on offense and not on defense, which we were all too much under the Obama administration with just kind of a regulatory agenda. Now the politics were different then in terms of who was in control of the Congress, but like suffice it to say, this is central to our economic agenda. And I think that bodes really well for us. It is bringing our political hat here. we really need to go district by district and state by state to localize the benefits of this economic recovery legislation and to be making this real for real people, whether that is like showcasing the factory that's gonna get up and running again to build the clean energy battery storage technologies that we need, or it's gonna be the small business who's helping train folks to go do restoration work out in the woods to be part of the climate solution. Like, we really need to be running a campaign, and we're raising funds to do this, that starts and by identifying the most powerful messages in this space, and then runs a campaign throughout the legislative and regulatory process that wins those wins on the back end, so that this is an agenda that our candidates run on in 2022 and don't run from. And we learned our lessons from the last time we tried to pass comprehensive legislation in 2009 and 10, that we did not have the war chest to have our friends' backs. And so we're trying to learn from that and to be able to come into this fight with the funds and resources we're going to need to stand with our friends and to push those who aren't with us.
I love that. And I think you're right. There's just so much economic opportunity to be had in the climate action that we need from a science-based climate goals perspective. So thanks for that. And keeping with the economics for just a second, just so wonderful to have folks like Janet Yellen and Brian Deese in positions that have not always been thought of as climate champions or positions for climate champs, and we've got them. What are the big picture economic policies look like that they're considering right now? Are we, we've seen a lot about cap and invest in different regions. Maine participates in a cap and invest program on power plant emissions, the regional greenhouse gas initiative. And then we've also seen a lot of advocacy around a sort of carbon fee and dividend policy. What can you tell us about that?
So there's really two questions here, Kathleen, so I'll try to address both of them here. One is, what are the tools that exist in Treasury and in our economic regulatory system to actually make it a climate agenda? And then second is there a role for like putting up a price on carbon or cap and trade system in the mix? So I'll sort of, if you're okay with it, I'll answer those kind of sequentially.
Thank you.
And this is one of the areas that I am definitely not an expert in, but I'm incredibly excited about the potential here. But the way I understand it is, if we help dry up the spigot of financial money and lending that goes to fossil fuel infrastructure, it is an absolute game changer, right? And so there are very arcane and small rulemakings that Treasury can do to make sure that the financial institutions that are lending actually are taking into account the risk of climate change and the exposure to fossil fuel assets, and those are going to be stranded assets. And so they can actually require that there's a higher ratio of capital to lending to account for that risk. And so that helps, suffice it to say, dry up funding resources and make the economic viability of fossil fuel companies lesser. And so we already seen that happening. That process is already happening with lenders and processes outside the federal government with climate risk disclosure projects and the write down of companies like ExxonMobil of their balance sheet. And so this is a really important part of the puzzle that was completely untapped under the past pro-climate administration of the Obama Biden team. And there's a lot of work to be done here. It is going to also unveil a suite of opposition that we saw with, like, think about the Dodd-Frank fight around financial regulatory reform. The big banks are not going to like this. And so it is thinking about our like political hat and our campaigner hat, like how do we push back on banks' opposition is a whole nother kind of flank or front in this climate agenda, to mix metaphors there. And then the second question you asked about, what about cap and dividend or cap and invest or a price on carbon? We are really defining the national climate agenda based upon what's been happening and passing in states over the last few years. And so that has looked like this standards, investments, and justice agenda. And so making sure that we have mostly sector by sector standards that drive the reductions we need in power and transportation sector and elsewhere. And then we're actually putting the dollars out to drive those investments. So we're getting the right clean energy infrastructure put in place. And then making sure that we're doing that in ways that, as I said, incentivize high road union jobs and deal with the legacy of injustice in communities of color and all importantly, the legacy of toxic pollution. Now, there is definitely a role potentially in the upcoming economic recovery legislation that I talked about for maybe a polluter pay, price on carbon, or other polluter fees to be part of paying for that package. But if you're thinking about a carbon tax as the environmental integrity mechanism, I don't think that's where the politics are. And it also isn't the silver bullet tool because it doesn't decarbonize in the transportation or building sector. And so it could be one of the tools in the toolbox, but it is not a silver bullet, I would say, and done wrong or done not thoughtfully, it can actually exacerbate inequality in the way that costs are passed on, and especially harm lower income families who have a higher energy burden and oftentimes have to choose between, can I pay for my medical bills or can I pay for my energy? And so we want to avoid that. And our on the political front, our opponents will attack whatever we're doing as a tax. And so making sure that we can actually deflect that. So like defending a clean energy standard or 100% clean power is a lot easier than trying to say a carbon tax is not a tax. So a few thoughts there.
Thanks, Sarah. It is, it's really great example of how important it is that we have equity concerns and perspectives baked in from the very beginning. So we're not, we're thinking about those program design impacts from the very beginning. So thank you. Let's switch gears from the mitigation side to the resilience, and what role is there for agriculture and healthy soils and carbon sequestration, and what does that look like for federal policies? You know, there's been quite a bit of conversation about that in Maine's climate action plan, and just curious about what that looks like nationwide.
Oh yeah, we can have a whole separate hour conversation about the all-important role of resilience and of natural solutions and carbon sequestration specifically. So I'll try to answer quickly so we can get to a few more questions, but we see a tremendous amount of opportunity here, and both because the science tells us that we have to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere. We've already emitted too much, and so doing that in ways that have other multiple benefits, like protecting ecosystems and protecting communities from increased climate impacts, like increased storm surge and others that these natural solutions can help with, is hugely important. But it's also a big part of the political hurdle that we have in building a broad base of support across urban, rural, red, and blue districts for action on climate. And so it's really important, and I should say our oceans can do a lot more in helping with this kind of new sort of blue carbon economy that's coming up too, and is incredibly hopeful and exciting. So I would say that it's a central piece, and it's a really exciting opportunity to build bridges with folks who have in rural America who've probably felt a little left behind by how we've been addressing the climate change crisis and even talking about it, but also the solutions we've been advocating for. We absolutely need our farmers and our ranchers and our foresters to be part of this solution, and they have a major role to play. And it doesn't hurt that will help us with our Senate vote count issues either.
Fair. Is there a official stakeholder process to get that feedback funneled into the policymaking?
Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up. One that's coming to mind right now is the stakeholder engagement process that was announced as part of the administration's executive actions related to the conserving 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. One of that includes that stakeholder process, including with, as I said, many of those stakeholders we just talked about, ranchers, farmers, foresters. And so that may be the best opportunity for engagement, but I have to circle back because that's just getting started. And so I don't think there's any like, next week we should all do X, Y, or Z, but I'd be happy to follow up offline.
Sure, and I know that sometimes there's a need to be involved in state level conversations on state policies and federal level conversations on federal policies, and it can be a lot. So what can an individual do? What's the single most important thing that any one of us on this call can do to support the incredible climate agenda and make sure that we keep making progress?
Oh, you're getting me with an easy question, like make my children. Well, I would say you're already part of doing what we need, which is an active and engaged citizenry. I mean, there's been a lot of academia that we need just 3.5% of the overall population to be engaged in pushing for change. And that's been part of the major social movements. That's been like the threshold tipping point. And so I would say the most important thing you can do in addition to supporting MCV financially and with your advocacy is to being engaged citizens and to engaging your families and your friends and getting them to be as engaged as you are in terms of both supporting institutions that are part of the solutions, but also being engaged in our political democracy, whether that be on the election side or in our advocacy work to hold politicians accountable. So those would be some of the pieces that I would mention. But as I said, we're transforming our economy and society at a pace and scale we've never seen. So literally the ways to engage and plug in here are infinite. And so it's just about people finding where they want to be most engaged. But you guys are you're already in the choir. You're already doing a huge amount of what you need to be doing. So I would say more, keep it up and spread the gospel to your friends and family. We need everybody. Now's not the time to sidestep difficult conversations. So.
Well said, well said. And it's a great reminder, you know, from the way we started off today with the poem from Amanda Gorman. Who would have thought a few years ago that the youth climate activists would be playing such an important role in this movement, and the next big push could come from any one of us. So thank you, Sarah.
Youth will save us all, Kathleen, if we're lucky. Yeah.
I'm really grateful that you could join us today, Sarah, and wish we had more time because there's a whole set of questions that we haven't had a chance to get to, but we know where to find you, and everybody on the call knows where to find us. So thank you. One of the topics that we talked a little bit about in the questions were stakeholder engagement in some of these climate solutions, and that's what we're going to be diving into next week. The specifics on offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine. There's, as I think most of us know, a really tremendous opportunity to create jobs and grow clean energy to meet our climate targets and reduce emissions. And we've got to do it right by engaging with Maine's fishing communities and environmental stakeholders. So Dan Burgess and Selena Cunningham from the Governor's Energy Office will be with us next week to walk us through those details and share some updates. Hope you can all join us, and until then, thank you, and have a beautiful weekend.